Imagine stepping into the minds of people capable of committing humanity's darkest crimes. Serial killers who, at first glance, seemed ordinary but harbored psychological profiles so unbelievable that even specialists were left astonished. In this video, we're diving deep into 6 true stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human behavior and what drives someone to commit such horrifying crimes. Have you ever found yourself trying to understand what separates a sane mind from a twisted one? Or wondered if there's a pattern, a warning sign, something that can be spotted before it's too late? As you follow each case, you'll gain insights into the complexities of the human psyche, information that may open your eyes to subtle dangers around you and expand your understanding of the boundaries of the human mind. This video isn't just an exploration of crimes. It's a journey to understand how certain extreme behaviors manifest, which might change your perspective on the world around you. Stick with me until the end to find out how these cases can teach valuable lessons, both about the depths of human nature and the importance of prevention and attention to detail. This content promises to shift your perception of normalcy and safety. Serial Killer 1, Jonathan Graves and the Obsessive Control. In a small suburb, where the houses were perfectly maintained and the gardens well tended, no one suspected that one of their kindest neighbors hid a dark secret. Jonathan Graves, a 42-year-old man, was known for his friendly smile and engaging conversations. He organized community barbecues, helped with neighborhood events, and even supported charity efforts. But behind that facade of respect and friendliness was a mind that left psychiatrists perplexed. Jonathan grew up in what seemed to be a stable family, but his childhood turned out to be a well of hidden traumas. His father, a strict military man, punished any misstep with severe physical discipline, while his mother was trapped in a cycle of neglect and submission. As a boy, Jonathan developed peculiar behavior. He had to control every detail of his environment, from the arrangement of his toys to the order of books on a shelf. Psychologists diagnosed him with obsessive-compulsive disorder, but over time, his need for control took a darker turn. In his teenage years, his desire for control evolved disturbingly. He began obsessively studying the human mind, fascinated by the power of manipulating people's emotions. His first crime was an experiment, seducing a female classmate, toying with her emotions, and then, in a cruel outburst, breaking things off abruptly. The girl spiraled into a state of complete vulnerability, and instead of feeling guilt, Jonathan experienced intense pleasure from having power over another person. As an adult, Jonathan became a master of emotional manipulation. He carefully chose his victims, lonely women who felt invisible to the world, using his charm to worm his way into their lives. But it wasn't just seduction. Jonathan created a web of psychological control, dominating every aspect of these women's routines until their emotional devastation was complete. It was as if he needed to see, feel, and touch the destruction he caused. It was like he held the keys to my mind, one survivor said in an interview with an investigator. The police were stunned by the profile of a killer who ruined lives without spilling a drop of blood. But Jonathan's darkest act? He would make daily visits to his victims in ruins, observing their suffering as if watching a play, savoring every second of emotional pain. Despite his obsessive caution, his need for control was what led to his downfall. During one of his voyeuristic visits, he slipped up and left a personal item at a victim's house, evidence that connected him to his crimes. The detective on the case still remembers the moment they finally caught Jonathan. He was perfectly calm, as if he'd already planned every possible outcome, even that one. Even after his capture, psychiatrists were intrigued. Jonathan Graves was a killer without blood on his hands but with countless shattered souls in his wake. It was a paradox that left a mark on modern criminology, an emotional predator whose victims bore invisible but irreparable scars. While Jonathan manipulated minds without physical violence, the next killer took the need for control to a lethal level, where every victim choice and act of brutality was as precise as a predator hunting its prey. Serial Killer 2, the Silent Predator. In the town of Redwood Valley, known for its peaceful landscapes and close-knit community, silence became synonymous with fear. Elliot Reeves, a 36-year-old man, was extremely discreet, always keeping a low profile. He worked as a librarian and seemed to disappear among the books and shelves, never drawing attention. But this ability to be invisible was part of something much more terrifying. He was a silent predator. From a young age, Elliot learned to survive in an environment of emotional emptiness. As the only child of distant parents, his home was a place of absolute silence, where emotions were suppressed and affection was foreign. He spent hours alone, creating worlds in his imagination to escape reality. Over time, these fantasies turned into a dark obsession, the idea that, to never become a victim, he needed to be the ultimate predator. Survival became his philosophy, a need to prove to himself that he was invincible. In his teenage years, while other teens worried about friendships and dating, Elliot devoured books about the art of hunting and the techniques of predators in nature. He studied patterns, observed animals, and drew parallels between these instincts and human behavior. His methodical behavior and lack of emotional outbursts worried his teachers, but not enough to raise suspicions. His face was a perfect mask of serenity, hiding the complete void within him. Elliot's first crime was a flawless execution of his learning. A young college student walking alone on a trail near the library became his victim. He watched her for weeks, studying every move until he could strike without leaving a trace. What set Elliot apart was his emotional coldness. On one occasion, while witnessing a severe car accident, he simply observed, unmoved, as others rushed to help. "Life is fragile," he murmured to himself, showing no reaction of shock or empathy. The police were baffled by the bodies that began to appear, always left with eerie precision. There was no evidence, only the unanswered terror of a predator's mind. The breakthrough in the case came from an ironic detail: his love for books. At one crime scene, police found a bookmark with partially wiped fingerprints. It was the first clue linking him to a victim. When officers cornered him, Elliot was at the library, reading calmly. "Is the game over?" he asked the detective, showing no hint of emotion. Even after his capture, the mystery remained. Elliot confessed to part of his crimes but omitted important details. He seemed to enjoy knowing that some of his hunts would remain eternal mysteries, a puzzle never to be completed. His face remained serene, without remorse or any sign of humanity. If Elliot's deadly silence was disturbing, the next killer turned each crime into a message so complex that even the best investigators felt powerless before his cerebral brutality. Serial Killer 3, The Intellectual Enigma. Brenton Falls was a town where mysteries had no place, a predictable location where each morning seemed to repeat the last. It was precisely in this setting that Dr. Samuel Hartley, a renowned mathematics professor at the local university, decided to make his mark. But his mark was not of ink or formulas, it was of blood and complex messages that puzzled even the most experienced detectives. From childhood, Samuel was considered a prodigy. His extraordinary talent in mathematics made him a phenomenon, but the pressure to maintain that reputation consumed him. During his teenage years, there were moments when he was publicly humiliated for making minor mistakes in competitions. Once, a harsh teacher exposed him in front of the whole class, calling him a failed genius for not solving a problem in record time. That wound never healed. Samuel vowed never to be underestimated again, determined to prove himself untouchable in his field. The need to be admired and feared became an obsession, fueled by a deepening narcissistic disorder. The first victim was found in a park near the university, the body arranged in a pattern only a mathematician would understand. In the victim's hand was a coded letter, full of equations and enigmatic symbols. The police quickly realized time was against them. Every clue they tried to solve led to a dead end or a disturbing discovery that seemed to mock their efforts. It was as if Samuel were playing a cruel game, where winning meant saving the life of his next victim. For the professor, each crime was more than an act of violence, it was a masterpiece, an intellectual test that defied any attempt at understanding. Psychologists profiled him and concluded he saw society as a giant chessboard where he always had to be several moves ahead. What made him even more astonishing was the calmness with which he executed his plans. Each murder was as calculated as solving an equation, as if everything were a mental exercise of superiority. Each crime was an intellectual challenge, commented one of the detectives leading the investigation. It was as if he wanted to prove that our inability to understand him was proof of his superiority. Fear and frustration grew among the investigative team, and the urgency weighed heavier by the second. But the tide turned when a young prodigy detective, with his own history of obsession with puzzles, joined the case. While analyzing one of Samuel's coded letters, he had a moment of revelation. His eyes lit up with understanding when he spotted a subtle numerical pattern everyone else had missed. "That's it," he murmured, adrenaline surging. "He's playing with infinity." The detective realized Samuel was using a complex mathematical theory to symbolize his twisted worldview, an equation that, like him, could never be completely solved. For the first time, the police could predict Samuel's next move. When they closed in on him, he was calmly waiting, a chessboard set up in front of him. "You arrived faster than I expected," he said, almost impressed, with a smile that hinted at respect for the young detective's intelligence. Samuel never fully revealed his motives, but before being taken away, he enigmatically mentioned, "Infinity is the only thing that truly matters." This phrase left investigators and specialists puzzled, wondering if it signified his belief in being incomprehensible or if it was a final challenge for someone to unravel his legacy. If Samuel's intellect made each crime a deadly chess game, the next killer had no patience for puzzles. He was brutal, direct, and driven by a fury no psychologist could fully comprehend. Serial Killer 4, The Uncontrollable Fury. While Samuel Hartley's crimes challenged the mind, the next serial killer had no interest in enigmas or coded messages. Lucas Hayes, a 29-year-old man, was driven by something primal and incomprehensible, a rage so overwhelming it turned any environment into a field of destruction. Born into a chaotic home where violence was the norm, Lucas learned early on that the world only respected strength. But unlike Samuel, he didn't want to prove intellectual superiority. He wanted the world to feel his pain. Lucas had no clear pattern. His victims varied, and his motives seemed to emerge from the chaos in his mind. He was like a hurricane, unpredictable and brutal. What made him truly terrifying was the speed at which he could transform from a calm man into a force of destruction. Psychologists diagnosed him with explosive personality disorder, but no one could understand where such intensity came from. "It was like a demon took over him," said one of the few people who knew him closely. The first victim was found in a dark alley, beaten so violently the scene looked straight out of a horror film. The police were horrified by the level of brutality and the apparent lack of any logic. The only constant in his crimes was chaos. Lucas attacked in fits of rage but always managed to disappear without a trace, as if his fury was paired with a near-animal survival instinct. "He was the perfect predator," commented a detective, "because we could never predict when or where he'd strike." Lucas's childhood was a series of tragedies. His father, a violent alcoholic, took out his frustrations on Lucas and his mother. He witnessed and experienced abuse so horrific that by his teenage years, his mind was already a minefield. In a moment of explosion, he severely injured a schoolmate who mocked his family's situation. But the system failed to intervene, and Lucas grew up, carrying that uncontrollable rage within him. The tension in the city was palpable, with each murder heightening the public's panic. People feared leaving their homes, and the police were constantly under pressure, with no solid leads. The urgency was suffocating. To catch Lucas, investigators needed to understand his pattern, but this was almost impossible since he attacked unpredictably. The case took an unexpected turn when one of his victims survived. Despite severe injuries, the woman managed to describe a crucial detail: Lucas's eyes. "They weren't the eyes of a man," she said, still in shock. "They were the eyes of someone who had nothing left to lose." The police finally got a break when Lucas made a mistake. During one of his outbursts, he left a fingerprint on a piece of shattered glass. When the detectives found him, he was in an abandoned building, surrounded by destroyed objects, as if he had just fought a battle against invisible ghosts. "It's too late," he murmured, with a hollow look, before being taken away by authorities. Even in prison, Lucas remained a mystery. No psychiatrist managed to connect with him. His rage was an inexplicable force, something even he didn't seem to fully understand. "I am what you made me," he said in one of the rare interviews he gave, leaving behind a sense of collective guilt, as if society had failed to contain him before it was too late. If Lucas's fury was an enigma without an answer, the next killer brought a new kind of fear, a perverse desire for fame that turned every murder into a grotesque spectacle for the public. Serial Killer 5, the fame-hungry narcissist. Mark Stevens was a name no one knew, but he dreamed of seeing it splashed across newspapers, headlines, and on everyone's lips. At 35 years old, Mark was not just a killer, he was a showman driven by an insatiable need for recognition. His desire for fame was born from a childhood spent in the shadow of his older brother, a prodigy athlete who always stole the family's and community's attention. The lack of love and approval ate away at Mark until he decided he would do anything to be noticed, even if it meant terrorizing the city. Mark worked as a sound technician for events, a role that kept him behind the scenes, where he felt invisible. He studied how people reacted to sound, to silence, and to anticipation, developing a sick fascination with controlling the attention of others. Psychologists later diagnosed him with a narcissistic disorder, but it was more than that. He craved to be adored or feared, and any intense reaction fueled his ego. Mark's first crime was a gruesome performance. He staged a murder scene in a public square, using speakers to draw people to the location. When the curious gathered, they found the body of his victim surrounded by a theatrical setup of lights and sound effects. Next to it, there was a note signed "The Master of Shows." He wanted the city to know that each act would be a masterpiece designed to shock and awe. And it worked. The media raced to cover the case, giving Mark exactly what he wanted, attention. But with each crime, the spectacle became more elaborate. Mark was a brilliant strategist, using his knowledge of sound and lighting to manipulate crowds and create scenes that seemed straight out of a horror movie. He loved watching the media coverage, reveling in the fame he had finally achieved. One detective, describing Mark, said, "He didn't kill just for the sake of killing. He wanted applause, he wanted to be the star of our fears." The investigation turned into a frantic race. The police had to decipher the patterns of his shows, which seemed to follow a theatrical script. The sense of urgency grew, because each day without answers made the city more scared, and Mark bolder. He began sending taunting messages to the newspapers, challenging the police to predict his next act. It was a sadistic game of cat and mouse, and he was savoring every moment. Mark's downfall came in an ironic way. He slipped up during one of his performances, a sound system malfunction exposed his position as he prepared the scene. The police finally cornered him, and when he was arrested, Mark seemed more relieved than defeated. "At least now," he said, with a satisfied smile, "you'll never forget my name." Even after his capture, the feeling that Mark still controlled the narrative lingered. He continued giving interviews, maintaining his status as the protagonist even from prison. "I created shows you'll never forget," he claimed, as if believing that the fame he sought was indeed eternal. If Mark Stevens craved the spotlight, the next killer preferred the shadows. His motivation was not to be seen but to disappear completely, taking secrets with him that the world would never understand. Serial Killer 6, the Shadow Vanisher. If Mark Stevens sought attention and the limelight, the last killer on this list was his absolute opposite. Damien Holt, 41 years old, was a man who wanted to vanish completely. Known as the Shadow Vanisher, Damien did not kill for fame but out of a dark desire to erase a past filled with unconfessable secrets. He lived like a ghost, moving from town to town without leaving a trace, as if he were running from something no one could identify. Damien grew up in the darkness of an isolated religious cult, where secrets and sins were buried under layers of fear and silence. The cult practiced strange and punitive rituals, and Damien's childhood was marked by abuse and manipulation, leaving him with unhealable scars. At 17, he escaped but never managed to outrun the shadows of his past. Psychologists later diagnosed him with dissociative identity disorder, and his life became a continuous attempt to erase any trace of his existence. What made him truly frightening was the precision with which he eliminated his victims, always people connected to his old life. His actions were cold, calculated, as if he were erasing pieces of a puzzle that no one should complete. Damien avoided connections, friends, or any sign of humanity that could tie him to someone. He was a master of disappearance, a man who moved like a shadow and left a trail of fear wherever he went. The first victim was a former member of the cult, found dead in a cheap motel. There were no signs of struggle, only a note with the word penance. The police took time to realize the crimes were connected, as Damien was a professional at hiding his presence. He didn't use flashy methods, his murders were clean, precise, as if he wanted to disappear along with the lives he took. He preferred silence and darkness, as if punishing himself along with his victims. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to notice a pattern. Each death seemed to represent a step toward Damien's past. It was as if he were trying to purge the sins of the cult that shaped him. It was a cycle of self-punishment and vengeance, one investigator commented. The police knew that capturing him would require a deep understanding of his traumas, but even the best psychological profiles failed to predict his moves. The hunt for Damien climaxed on a quiet night in a forgotten village where he planned his final act. The detectives, aware that this was their last chance, surrounded the area with caution. When they finally found him, he was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the void. "You can't save me," he murmured, with an emotionless voice, before being taken into custody. It was as if he were trying to escape, not just from the police but from himself. Even in prison, Damien never fully revealed what had happened within the cult that broke him. "Some secrets should die in the shadows," he said, ending the conversation with a silence that left more questions than answers. He was a man who wanted to disappear, but whose actions ensured he would never be forgotten. With each of these stories, we stepped into the minds of 6 killers whose psychological profiles defy all logic. From Jonathan Graves' subtle manipulation to Lucas Hayes's uncontrollable fury, through Samuel Hartley's intellectual obsession and Mark Stevens's grotesque performances, each one showed us a different, terrifying side of the human condition. What ties all these cases together isn't just the violence but the complexity of what it means to be human. Each killer had deep motivations, traumas that shaped them, or a burning desire that consumed them. Jonathan sought control to compensate for a chaotic childhood. Elliot hunted like the perfect predator, escaping his lonely past. Samuel wanted to challenge the world with his genius, while Lucas was driven by a fury without explanation, born from years of abuse. Mark craved attention, and Damien only wanted to erase what never should have happened. The reflection that remains is unsettling. The line between human and monster can be thinner than we think. What would happen if circumstances were different? If the people around had noticed the signs? If the right interventions had been made in childhood? Questions like these are what make these cases both fascinating and frightening. Even with all the studies on the human mind, we still don't have all the answers. Science and criminology continue trying to understand the labyrinths of the brain, and each discovery raises more questions than answers. What we learn is that evil can come from anywhere, and human psychology is a mix of experiences, traumas, and choices that don't always make sense. So, even as we conclude this video, the echoes of the stories of Jonathan, Elliot, Samuel, Lucas, Mark, and Damien still resonate. Each one is a reminder that behind every monstrous act is a human being with a story. Stories that don't justify but explain, and that leave a mark that is hard to erase. If you found these stories as fascinating as they are disturbing, leave a comment with your thoughts or which case you found most unbelievable. And subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the darkest minds of crime.